Hey, welcome to Chapter 17, the endocrine system. We're going to be talking about the endocrine system, the endocrine organs, and the hormones that are produced from those organs. We will go over how those hormones coordinate different mechanisms in the body, like blood pressure, blood glucose levels, growth, metabolism, and they even function in our stress response. So in long-term stressors as well as short-term. But when I think of endocrine, I typically think of that long-term stress response. So one thing I liked about, I like about this textbook is at the beginning it gives this analogy of the nervous system and the endocrine system. So when you're looking at the endocrine system, you can think of it like a text message. I think that's how they say it here. I'm just looking quickly. When you think about, oh, where did I see that? It was like on page 732. It talks about the endocrine system like a text message, and the nervous system's like a telephone. So with the nervous system, you get a very fast, immediate response. The information moves from one organ, so the nervous system, to an effector, and the response is super quick. Whereas in the endocrine system, the response is slower. So that would be like a text message. So think about asking someone if they want to go out for lunch or go have a drink. If you're in the endocrine system, in the endocrine system, that might take a little bit of time. So you might ask like a text message, and they might respond an hour or so later and say, hey, yeah, that sounds fun. If in the nervous system, that same thing would be like a telephone call where you call, they answer, you say, hey, you want to go for lunch, and they respond immediately. So you know what's going on. The difference is, though, that the endocrine system response typically lasts a long time, and it can send signals through or to many different organs at the same time. When you call someone, you're calling one person. If you are sending a text message, you can message 5, 10 people at the same time saying, hey, you want to get some lunch together? So it's very similar, and I thought that was really cool how they talked about this. And so here you're looking at some characteristics of the nervous system and characteristics of the endocrine system. The nervous system sends chemicals through neurons. Those chemicals are known as neurotransmitters, and the response is very rapid and it is immediate. And they typically affect one organ. So like your sweat glands or skeletal muscle. Whereas, and it might be one specific skeletal muscle. With the endocrine system, the chemical sent is called a hormone. It's sent through the blood, not through neurons. The response lasts for a long time, and it can affect multiple organs. There are a lot of endocrine glands, not as many as there are like bones of the body. So, you'll be happy when we take our endocrine quiz, I think. Endocrine glands are glands that produce endocrine hormones. We also have non-endocrine organs that produce hormones. So they have both endocrine and other functions. So we'll talk about those endocrine first, the strict endocrine organs, and then we'll talk about some of these non-endocrine organs that we typically talk about in this chapter anyways. So up here we have the brain, and in that diencephalon region, we have a tiny endocrine organ back here called the pineal gland, and one up here called the pituitary gland, so pineal and pituitary. These are both endocrine organs. In fact, the pituitary is typically thought of as the master gland. Then here we have the thyroid gland. If we flip the thyroid gland and look at the posterior aspect, we see parathyroid glands. Those are both endocrine organs. And down here we have the adrenal glands. Adrenal glands sit just on top of our kidneys, and they are strict endocrine organs. The thymus, the pancreas, ovaries, and testes are all endocrine and exocrine organs. So they produce endocrine functions. I won't say exocrine. I'll say endocrine organs, but they also are organs of other organ systems. That's what I'll say. They all produce endocrine hormones, but they also have other functions. So an example, oh, and I didn't mention the hypothalamus as well up here has both endocrine and exocrine, which we've talked about, or endocrine and other functions. We've talked about the hypothalamus in the nervous system. Now we're going to talk about the hypothalamus in the endocrine system. The thymus functions in the endocrine system, but it also functions in the immune system. The pancreas functions in the endocrine system and the digestive system. Ovaries and testes function in the endocrine system, but also in the reproductive system. So, and that's just a few of the more important organs. There's a lot of organs that produce endocrine hormones, which we'll talk about more in their chapters than here, but we will mention some of them here as well. These are just some of those more important endocrine and non-endocrine structures. One that we've already talked about is calcitriol is produced first in the integument. Remember when UV radiation hits the integument, it takes a precursor to calcitriol and converts it into another precursor that moves to the liver. Then it is converted to a third precursor that moves to the kidneys, and then the kidneys convert it to calcitriol, which is a hormone that is released. And hopefully you remember the function of calcitriol, but I'm sure I'll mention it again, so don't worry if you don't. Other organs we'll mention is the heart. The heart produces a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide that helps in blood pressure, but I'll probably talk more about that in the cardiovascular system. So what are the chemicals that are released from the endocrine system? They are called hormones, which I mentioned already. Hormones leave the endocrine organ, and they enter the blood. And so there are two broad categories of these hormones. We have amino acid hormones, and then we have lipid hormones. And depending on the type of hormone, when they travel in the blood, they're either going to travel on a carrier molecule, or they're going to just travel free in the blood plasma to their target cells. And so under the amino acid hormones, we have amine hormones, peptide hormones, and protein hormones. These are all produced from amino acids. So the difference is amine hormones are derived from one single amino acid, either tryptophan or tyrosine. Peptide hormones and protein hormones are derived from multiple amino acids. Peptide hormones are short chains of amino acids, and protein hormones are long chains of amino acids. And then we have steroid hormones, which are your lipid-based, and these are all derived from cholesterol. So if you are a lipid-based molecule, or there are a couple amine hormones that are also nonpolar, and so the and the example, I guess, is the thyroid hormone is an amine hormone that actually follows the same pathway. Um, remember from when we talked about the plasma membrane, you have hydrophilic heads facing out and facing inside, but we have those hydrophobic tails that are sandwiched in between. And so any molecules that are too large or that are polar are not going to be able to move through that plasma membrane. Our lipid soluble hormones and the thyroid hormone, those, which is an amine hormone, those are nonpolar and they're small enough that they can move directly through that plasma membrane. And so they travel in the blood carried on a protein known as albumin. And then once they leave the blood to their target cell, they hit that target cell, they're going to move through the plasma membrane, enter the cell, and that's where they're going to find their receptor. And so the hormone and receptor will complex together, and then they will bring about a change. In this case, the change is they're producing some type of a protein. If you have a water-soluble hormone, so other or most of our amine hormones are peptide hormones and our protein hormones, these hormones are water soluble, and our protein hormones are super large as well. And so they're not going to be able to move through that plasma membrane. So they have a target cell receptor on the surface of the cell. They bind to that target cell receptor, and that activates another protein inside called a G protein. The G protein is a link between the primary or first messenger, which is the hormone, and a second messenger molecule. The most common second messenger molecule we have is cyclic AMP. And so cyclic AMP is activated, and then it brings about the change that that hormone normally would do. And so in this case, we are taking an inactive protein and we're activating it in the cell. But again, in both cases, water-soluble and lipid-soluble hormones, they can do multiple things. It depends on what we need, okay? So they're not all just going to activate a protein or produce a protein. Some might turn off protein synthesis. Some might cause the cell to start proliferating faster. You know, it just depends on what's going on. All right, I'm going to stop here and we'll get into our next lecture in a few minutes. Bye.